Chapter 5, November 1st, 1967. "Step aside, sailor." The sailor glanced down at Mike Allen with a hefty hue of hesitation. He stood 6'3" and nearly hit the lantern hanging from the hallway ceiling. The sailor was backlit, and Mike stood under the better part of his shadow. He held himself well, shoulders back and chest puffed out. As far as Mike was concerned, the bigger they were, the harder they fall. The sailor stood at attention, with his hands firmly clasped behind the curvature of his lower back. "Son, don't make me ask you a second time. I don't have time for exposition nor incompetence," he said while pulling out his detective shield. Mike flapped open his leather badge and dangled the badge in front of the sailor. "Sir, I don't know you from Adam. I was told to guard this bulkhead until the captain came back to relieve me of duty. Those are my orders, and I'm sticking to them." Evidently, the seaworthy sailor remained agnostic in his agreeableness. He didn't budge an inch. He probably figured Mike was all show and no go. Thud, 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 thud. The captain came marching down the corridor like a heat-seeking missile homing in on its target. His steel-toed boots made a lasting impression on the ambiance of the hallway. The sailor leaned over to inspect the corridor. He immediately recognized the sound of the boots. More often than not, those boots were a dog whistle to the crew to get back to work. "Sailor, make a hole." The sailor picked up his knee and sidestepped to the anterior part of the hallway. "This is the room, huh?" "Room B474. This is the room," he said while opening the door. Mike placed his hand on the back shoulder of the curmudgeonly captain. The captain huffed a deep breath as he fondled the doorknob. There was an uneasy hesitation to his hand, like the nervous hand of a 17-year-old pinning a brooch to his prom date. "Let me take over here," Mike said while relieving the captain of the burden of opening the door to the crime scene. The captain did what he did best, which is to say he delegated work to his subordinates. He nodded in confirmation. Mike quickly glanced around the room to look for clues. If there was one thing he learned working crime scenes, it was you don't want to miss the forest for the trees. Sometimes the smallest detail can make the biggest difference. The stench of the blood-stained blankets soaked the air like a malfunctioning sauna. Mike stuck up his hand in the air and motioned the captain into the room. The captain stepped through the doorway with a cautious tone. "Captain, do me a favor." The captain looked at Mike Allen with a confused expression. The furry brows of his forehead were neatly plucked, like a well-pruned bonsai tree. "Look at your feet." "Oh. Oh is right. How many footprints do you see?" "At least, 10 sets of footprints? Maybe more." "That's precisely my point. Yours, mine, the family's, the bellhop. I need a list of everyone who entered this room. I need a list of anyone and everyone who worked this deck." "Sailor, on the double." The captain snapped his finger and the sailor stepped into the room. He extended his hand over to the captain with a list of names on it. The sailor was prancing around the room trying to avoid tampering with the crime scene. Mike was somewhat skeptical about the finicky finalization of his request. Any time information was received with that kind of speediness, there was often more to the story than meets the eye. "Thanks." Mike snatched the list from the captain and pulled it close to his face. He dragged his index finger down the list, read the names aloud. "Captain Jones, Seaman Brody, Olivia Marie." The list wasn't as fruitful as Mike initially inspected. Mike partially crumpled the list and handed it back to the captain. Mike imagined this is how Robert E. Lee must have felt when surrendering at Appomattox. He took a deep, deliberate breath and intentionally inhaled warm sea air. The air had a toughness to it, like the aroma produced after cooking a steak on a frying pan. "This isn't much to go on," Mike said while kneeling down to get a better lay of the land. The sailor spontaneously slapped his knee in response to the comment. Mike spent an entire career beating the odds, breaking the mold and shattering expectations, Without a moment's break in concentration, Mike asked, "Something funny?" "Other than a detective complaining about not having enough evidence to work a case." Mike scoffed his response and slowly stood up. There was a palpable stench sautéing the air with an aroma of stink. Blood had a way of ruining an ambiance. "I'm glad you can find some humor in this situation. Look, son, I was handed this mess. If you want to explain to the Port Authority how you were one of the 3 people who discovered the crime scene, then I can walk away right now and call it a day." The captain stepped back into the conversation by grabbing the sailor by the arm and whispering something into his ear. Mike had considerable amount of experience with a good ear chewing. He considered getting chewed out par for the course when working for the government. Public service wasn't glamorous by any means, but it held a certain credulity with Mike. Even the best workers ended up getting chewed out once in a blue moon. "How can we help?" "At this point, I fear the worst." "The worst?" "Based on the sheer volume of blood, spatter patterns, and time." The captain sighed in disappointment. Mike instinctively grabbed his chin and rubbed it intensely. "You've been here 5 minutes, and you're giving up on us?" "Captain." "Some detective. You believe this guy?" Mike took his hands and rubbed them along the side of his head. He slicked back his hair and clasped his hands behind his head. He looked around the room for a moment for any semblance of a clue. In a moment of clarity, he asked, "Where's Olivia?" "Olivia?" "She was the first in the room, was she not?" The captain turned to the sailor and pointed at him. Without hesitation, the sailor jumped into high gear and escorted Olivia into the room. She immediately ran to the corner of the room and dry heaved like a cat with a fur ball stuck in his mouth. Mike did an about-face and questioned the young deckhand. The way Mike figured it, never let a good tragedy go to waste. He squatted down in front of Olivia. "Tell me what happened again?" "Like I told you before, I just opened the door to find all of this." "Then what happened?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, tell me what happened after that." Olivia paused for a moment and said, "Nothing. I just left the room. What was I supposed to do?" "Just like that. You got up and left." "I got up and left." You stumble onto what is obviously a crime scene, and you just left." "Like I said." "Did you turn the lights back off?" "The lights were on when I entered the room." "So you kept them on?" "I wasn't thinking of the utility bill when I ran out of the room. I was scared out of my mind and ran for the bridge." Mike started tapping on the floor with his left foot. Tap, tap, tap. "Now we're getting somewhere. You see the blood. You frantically run out of the room. Did you see any other guests?" "Other guests? The hallways were empty." "No one?" "No one." "You arrive at the room. No other guests come out of the room. You run out of the room in a commotion. No one comes out of their rooms." "Look, mister, I don't know how many times you plan on asking me the same question in a different way. I told you what I saw. Nothing. I wish I could be more helpful, but I didn't see anything." "That'll be all, darling," Mike said while hoisting his hand towards the door like a bouncer lowering a velvet rope for a VIP. Olivia scurried out of the room like a mouse running away with a piece of cheese. She had this unusual waddle, almost like a limp. "Captain, if I may have a word in private," Mike asked. He gestured over to the captain, with a nothing more than an expression. The captain leaned in and asked, "What's our situation?" Mike gave it to the captain how he ate sushi, which is to say, raw. "We have 2 non-witnesses, a tarnished crime scene, and 4 missing bodies." The captain nodded his head at the bleak assessment of the situation. The captain was a man of action. He appreciated the lack of foreplay. "So what you're saying is, you found nothing?" "I'm saying we have a truncated timetable, a crime scene that is about as fucked up as a soup sandwich, and no leads." "What are you suggesting exactly?" That being said, we need to scour the boat for some kind of clue or sign of life. And what? Try not to panic the thousands of guests on board in the process? There'll be a mutiny on our hands if this gets out. There are 4 motives for murder, Captain. Lust, love, loot, and loathing. It's safe to say we can rule out love, lust, and loot. How do you figure? Presumably, no one heard so much as a peep. This was a fast attack under the cover of darkness. Was this a crime of passion? The bodies are all missing and there's no fingerprints to be found. Lust? I think not, sir. Not on a cruise of this magnitude. Everyone who is on this boat is here for a reason, not by accident. A cruise that keeps meticulous records of passengers and staff, Mike said while trailing off. He pulled out a pen from his lapel and started prodding various parts of the mattress. Tell me, Captain, when you look at these blood spatters, what do you see? What do I see? What kind of question is that? Tell me, what do you see? What I see is violence, sir. I see violence. You know what I see? No, I don't have the slightest idea. What do you see? Precision, elegance, catharsis. No, Captain, this is a serial killer we have on our hands here. These weren't the strikes of an angry man. These were the strikes of a crazy man. These weren't the strikes of a rank amateur. You seem pretty certain the killer is a man. We suspect there are dozens, maybe hundreds of active serial killers in America. What we are sure of is that all known serial killers end up being men. This was no crime of convenience. This was clearly a crime of methodical planning. A plan that was interrupted by... Interrupted? By what? By what? By whom? That's what I intend to find out. Mike squatted down to inspect one of the blood-laden footprints. From the looks of it, it was a man's shoe, but couldn't have been more than a size 7 or 8. Mike pulled out his wallet and flipped through some freshly minted dollar bills. He pulled out one of the bills, examined it for a second, and snapped both ends. He delicately pasted the bill down next to the footprint. What you got there, Alan? The captain said in an authoritative baritone. Mike looked back to the captain and said, At this point, nothing but a hunch. A hunch. Okay, what can I do? The captain's request was followed by a harrowing sigh. Mike pulled the bill from the ground and gently ran his fingers through his hair. Buy me some time, Captain. Can you do that? The captain leaned up against the door jamb and started tapping his index finger on the door frame. Mike could see him working out the problem in his head. Time. How much time do you need? I can only slow the boat for so long without people starting to ask questions. Crime scene investigation in the best of circumstances was as much art as it was science. Mike had worked thousands of crime scenes over the years, but this was the first crime scene that floated. Mike planted his hands firmly on his knees and bounced back up from his squatted position. Now was not the time for observation. Now was not the time for pontification. Now was the time for action. Figured a man like you was apt at deflecting unwelcome questions. The captain beamed a smile. He clearly appreciated Mike's moxie and replied curtly, Fair enough. What's our ETA? ETA is approximately 9, maybe 10 hours tops. Whatever you plan on doing, detective, I hope you do it quick. Mike shook his head and said with an exacting tone of voice, I'll need the entire ship. An escort for the evening. No questions asked. The captain was a man of rigid ideology, but shrewd enough to realize the sand was shifting beneath his feet. He placed his left hand on Mike's shoulder and whispered, Whatever you need to solve this case, consider it done. Without a moment's delay, Mike accepted the offer and said, I need someone quick on their feet, someone who can take orders, someone who knows this boat like the back of their hand. The captain nodded and stuck his head down the hallway. The hallway was littered with personnel attempting damage control with the noisier guests. First Mate Hodges, front and center. A younger-than-expected sailor pranced to the front of the doorway. He peered his head in for a moment and locked eyes with Mike Allen. "Sir?" "First mate, this is Detective Mike Allen. You are to stick on him like glue. He moves, you move. Wherever he needs to go, you take him. Whatever he needs, you get it. Understood?" "Sir, what in by George is going on?" Protesting an order wasn't a muscle the first mate exercised very often. Like any underdeveloped muscle, if you don't use it, it gets very weak. "For the next 9 hours, help Detective Allen with whatever he needs. Copy that?" The first mate was well aware that disobeying orders was a pretext to mutinous insurrection. He was keenly attuned to the fact that this wasn't the Queen's Royal Navy, but would still suffer undue consequences for openly dejecting the captain's orders. "Sir, yes, sir.